All right. Good evening, everybody. My name is Lily. My pronouns are she, her. I am the co-chair for the Charlottesville DSA chapter. And I'll pass it over to my comrade for him to introduce himself.
Hi everyone, my name is Robert. I am the treasurer for the chapter and part of the Socialist Night School working group. Lily and I are going to be tonight's facilitators. I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us. It's great to see so many new faces again. This is our second Socialist Night School, which is a political education initiative that we have recently started with Charlottesville DSA. If you would like to receive updates for future sessions that we have planned, I am just about to post a form in the chat that you can fill out to get added to our mailing list. We have a couple more sessions, at least a couple more sessions that we plan to do before the end of the year. If you missed the first session, which was an introduction to socialism, Socialism 101, we are going to be doing that again on the 29th of this month. That's a Thursday at 7 o'clock. And so before Lily and I begin, I just want to go over some protocols and guidelines that will help things go as smoothly as possible. We just ask that you please be polite and respectful of others' opinions. And there will be some moments throughout the presentation where we will throw out some questions. You will have a chance to participate. You can type your responses in the chat. If you would like to speak, we will let you know when there are opportunities for that. But again, we just ask that you be respectful of others' opinions, conscious of the time that you take up, so that others who want to participate can get a chance to do so. While the facilitators are speaking, everyone will be on mute. You're welcome to ask a question at any time, just type it in the chat. And the last thing I want to add is that we give everyone the benefit of the doubt that you're here in good faith. If you've just come, however, to debate and to lecture people, then we just ask that you leave. If you decide not to abide by these rules, we take security of everyone here very seriously, and we will boot people who don't abide by our simple requests and guidelines. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to my co-host Lily, and I just want to apologize if you hear the sound of squeaking dog toys in the background.
Yes, we just got a new puppy. His comrade Potato is like currently behind me, like chomping down on a squeaky hedgehog. Robert and I are partners, so you will probably hear Comrade Potato and both of our screens simultaneously. We apologize. Maybe poor timing on our part. But next slide. Welcome to Socialist Night School, Myths of Capitalism. We were going to go ahead and kick it off tonight just with like a couple intro questions. And I think that it's kind of like a small enough group that we can just kind of like openly talk. So feel free to unmute yourself and kind of like shout out the quick answers to any of these questions. Or if you're more comfortable, you can go ahead and type them in the chat. So the first question is, so what are some myths or cliches about work and success that you often hear? I know as somebody who grew up in a working class family, the like work your fingers to the bone, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I know that those are some really common ones that I grew up with here. And are there any other ones that people are pretty familiar with?
I guess that whole kind of rise and grind Instagram influencer kind of thing fits under here too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I also see Melissa in the chat. Your paycheck is your report card of life. Yeah, absolutely. God, that's horrific. Like, you know, kind of the old like worth your weight in salt type of speak. So what are some assumptions about capitalism that we are taught to assume are true without questioning them? So I know, for instance, to kick it off, I was taught in my high school government class, like capitalism was taught halfway throughout that class as like, that is our government. Our government is like these sections of institutions, like the executive branch, and capitalism was like taught side by side. Robert, do you want to throw out some like assumptions of capitalism that maybe like we take for granted?
Yeah, I mean, just this idea that, you know, the invisible hand of the market is going to take care of everything, that we should just, you know, leave everything to the market and that will decide how best to allocate resources. Yeah, so Elizabeth just said capitalism is a fair way to distribute resources. And a lot of that's based on a market. Although, of course, markets aren't exclusive to capitalism. Markets existed before capitalism as well.
Yeah, and like capitalism creates jobs, right? We have to support capitalism because that's where all of our jobs come from. We wouldn't have jobs without it. Change whatever the market will bear.
And it's the only possible system. And we're going to talk about why it is that people think that.
Yes, anyone can be rich if they work hard enough. Like we all hear that throughout our entire lives. The reason that we all aren't billionaires right now, right, is because like we didn't work hard enough in our garages for it. Capitalism is the natural way for humans to live. Absolutely. Innovation only happens in capitalism, right? We wouldn't have technology without it. Let's see, it's good to be free to spend and buy more. Yeah, that's the only way to be. These are all great. Thank you guys so much. This is like getting us revved up because we have a really good presentation for you. So what do you think about when you hear the term ideological? What does ideology mean? Just throw out some like vague examples if y'all want. All right, well, nobody's answered. So we're going to go into the presentation. We've got plenty of examples of what ideology is.
We got a couple. So
Oh.
belief system, dogmatic. Yeah, when I thought of this question, that's kind of what I was trying to get at, you know, at least when I, you know, growing up, like I was always taught that, you know, ideological is a bad thing. Like, you know, you shouldn't be so rigid in your thinking, and ideological, you know, it's a refrain that we often hear.
Yeah.
So dogmatic, like Joe says.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right, well, so let's go ahead and kick this off, and we'll jump into all of these. So we are going to be starting out with myths. All right, so myths is going to be kind of like the basis of the whole conversation that we're talking about. So there are a couple different functions of myths. So myths serve really four main functions. So the first one is mystical, so making sense of what lies beyond our comprehension, right? So the universe is full of wonder, glory, mystery, that we're all just kind of in awe. And myths make sense. They help us like realize and understand what is beyond our comprehension. The second function is cosmological, explains how the universe works by providing explanations for the creation of the world. So like the origin of human life, the change in the seasons, philosophical questions like what is our purpose in life? What is the meaning of life? And then the third functions of myths are sociological functions. So supporting and validating a certain social order. So the purpose of a myth can be greatly depending upon a particular society. Naturally, a myth of capitalism would promote the system and its values. And then the last function of a myth is pedagogy, how to behave as a member of society. So we're going to be talking a lot about this. So how to live a human lifetime under circumstances. So myths teach us that, right, there's different rites and rituals that are expected of us to go through and learn how to function as responsible and ethical members of society. So next slide. So a myth is a way of making sense in a senseless world. Myths are narrative patterns that give significance to our existence, from good old Rollo. Next slide. So for this, we're going to really, like I said, be focusing on like two main types of myths, right? So we have the etymological myth. Myths seek to explain natural phenomenon or really an origin story, versus like myths of propaganda. So tall tales that often serve as like a higher ideological purpose. So whether or not that was like the original intention of that myth. So especially as like today, originally being Columbus Day. So just thinking about like, what are some popular American myths? What are things that like we think about that are contributing currently to like myths of like our origin story in America? We got some slides to kind of get you warmed up on like thinking of what those are. So if you just want to like type into the chat, maybe some myths of America. You know, we've got like the kind of like traditional myth of like George Washington kind of like being like a superhero, like the most intelligent person. We're the good guys, yeah, freedom and liberty, rags to riches. We're the world police, land of the free, home of the brave. Yeah, boundless natural resources. Yeah, absolutely. So in American mythology, for example, the predominant myth in the United States promotes individualism, like the American dream, which also supports white supremacy. So the founding myth is that American Revolution brought freedom and democracy, yet the revolution in actuality is really marked by limited popular involvement, mainly among white and male populations. Which created institutions to solidify the rule of a new local ruling class based on expansionism, genocide, and slavery. So the manifest destiny. So I think that it's appropriate when we're discussing so-called Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day, although not American, Columbus has much of a starring role in American foundational myths, just as much as anyone else in the founding fathers that we so commonly hear people talking about. So with the doctrine of discovery is a medieval proclamation stating that Europeans have the right to any lands that they come across, so whether they inhabited or not, and which is what inspired the founding fathers like Jefferson. So really this idea of like, it doesn't matter if people have been like living on certain lands or areas for thousands of years. They didn't formally claim it as theirs, they didn't write up the documents as theirs, and by doing so, then automatically makes this now your property. So remarkably, or not so remarkably, this medieval doctrine was cited in a 2005 Supreme Court case, the city of Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation of New York, which prevented the tribe from reestablishing sovereignty and purchasing the land back because the court determined that in fact this land had never been owned by the nation in the first place. So who wrote the majority opinion on this case? None other than RBG. I know that like maybe this is kind of shocking news, but just hang in there with us and we'll explain like why some of our normative pop culture heroes that are, you know, we all kind of view them as like the non-biased, level-headed like thinkers and intellectuals of our society. We're going to talk more about like why some of these decisions might be made by people that we perceive as neutral. So also just keeping in mind that the legacy of colonizing the American Revolution is made quite easy, obsessively so by American leaders to promote dominant values of capitalist society, which reflect on the working class, right? Like we are at the other end of all of those myths. So as we can see, like today specifically is a day, we see them all around us, monuments that are glorifying these myths that we've just kind of briefly covered. or the central characters of these myths are all around us. You know, we've got a statue of Jefferson and a statue of Lewis and Clark, like from our house, like maybe 500 feet. So even though we're here in 2020, it's taken us centuries to even really start to begin to confront how harmful these myths are, right? Like we're taught these myths in elementary school, we put on Thanksgiving pageants, and we as like a mainstream society response are only really starting to confront these types of myths.
All right, and so an important figure who had a lot to say about the power of myth making and how myths control our popular discourse is the Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci. He was at one time the leader of the Communist Party of Italy. He was a very influential figure in Marxism. He really built upon the ideas originally set down by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. He was born in 1891 in Sardinia, which is one of the poorer regions of Italy. Although his family wasn't super poor, they struggled to get by. He struggled with disabilities his entire life. But he moved to Turin, which is in the north of Italy, to study at university, where he met other Marxist intellectuals and figures who would go on to become influential in the socialist movement. And at the time, and really still today, Turin is a city of heavy industry. It's home to car companies like Fiat and Lancia, which attracted poor people from the rural areas, especially in the south, to come and work in the factories. And so he saw things like trade unions starting to form around him. And already there was a clear divide between the north and the south in Italy. The north was very industrialized, was not only the political center, but also, you know, the economic and cultural center of Italy. Gramsci was a very natural writer and public educator. He first came to public attention as a writer for socialist newspapers in Turin. He gave public lectures. He was a supporter of early anti-fascist movements that sought to prevent the rise of Mussolini and his black shirts, which were like roving bands of militia, you know, not too dissimilar to what we see today. Except these were controlled directly by Mussolini, and really played a big role in his rise to power, quite literally, with the March on Rome in 1922, when they literally marched into Rome and took power. So from 1924 to 1926, he was the leader of the Communist Party. In 1926, Mussolini and the fascists cracked down on all opposition, but especially socialists and communists, and Gramsci was arrested and spent basically the rest of his life in prison. And while in prison, he wrote some of his foundational texts, which collectively are known as the prison notebooks. And these are the actual notebooks that he wrote, which were collected and all put together. He wrote them piecemeal over the course of a few years. But really one of his biggest insights was that culture is fundamental to the attainment of power. That was one of his big contributions to Marxism. And I'm going to explain a little bit about what exactly he meant by that in a little bit. But just to provide a little bit of context, so the period from 1917 to 1923 was a time of great turmoil, immediately following the disaster of World War I. Obviously, one of the biggest events to come out of this was the Russian Revolution of 1917. There were actually many other attempts at socialist revolutions across Europe. One of the most notable was the German November Revolution of 1918, which was also known as the Spartacist Uprising, led by another major Marxist intellectual, Rosa Luxemburg. Her organization, called the Spartacus Bund, later became the German Communist Party. And she was murdered essentially by the government who was in power at the time, which happened to be some of her former comrades in the Social Democratic Party of Germany, who were just more moderate and not in favor of revolution. So one of the things that there were also other unsuccessful attempts. So in Hungary, the Netherlands, Belgium, there were massive strikes in Spain, even as far flung as Australia, Argentina, the Middle East. were attempts at socialist revolution, but they all failed, except in one place, in Russia. And Russia was actually the last place that anyone thought a socialist revolution would occur. Karl Marx said it himself. He thought it was much more likely that a socialist revolution would happen in a place like the United States or in the UK, where capitalism had already developed to an advanced stage. And so Gramsci wanted to answer these questions. What went wrong? Why had socialist revolutions failed all across the world, but succeeded in Russia? And how had capitalism managed to survive this tumultuous period? And so the ruling ideology amongst Marxists before Gramsci was known as economism, or based on economism. It's this idea that history of a given society progresses through stages that are defined by their economic structures. So societies will transform naturally over time from oppressive economic systems like feudalism, for example, to more liberating ones like neoliberal capitalism, until finally the state of communism in society is reached. So Marxism at the time was deeply rooted in a scientific historical materialism, which is the idea that things will play out as they will. This belief that history operates in certain ways, and that the contradictions that are inherent in capitalism would eventually lead to its downfall. And Marx himself believed that only countries which had gone through this full development of capitalism would be in a position to move beyond it. There were actually socialist groups in Russia before the revolution who opposed revolution. They thought that since Russia at the time was essentially a medieval feudal society, they thought that Russia had to go through the development of capitalism first and had to develop a bourgeoisie and a proletariat working class, and that all of this had to go in order, and then they could have a socialist revolution. So you can imagine how that played out, saying that we need to bolster capitalism, socialists saying that we need to bolster capitalism so that way it can lead to its own downfall, kind of an accelerationist view. But that was the thinking of Orthodox Marxists at the time. And so what Gramsci claimed was that the October Revolution in Russia sort of invalidated these ideas, that the socialist revolution had to await the full development of capitalist forces in order to awake this proletarian class. And so on the plus side, what this reflected was that Marxism was not this rigid determinist philosophy. It affirmed that individuals in a capitalist system actually possess agency. We don't need to just sit around and wait for capitalism to collapse on itself. It'd be great if it did, but we haven't seen that happen, and we've been waiting for a couple hundred years at least. However, one thing that this did not disprove, according to Gramsci, was that the proletarian class was the only class capable of reaching a sort of class consciousness necessary for revolution. So that only the working class who came to realize and see their own exploitation and their own alienation could lay the groundwork for the eventual overthrow and replacement of capitalism. So economic determinism doesn't tell us as much as we thought it did. We can't just sit around and wait for the laws of history to unfold. And so something else is clearly going on here. And the two main questions, again, that he asked himself were, how has capitalism continued to defend itself? And why is it that some people work against their own self-interest? What's going on? And he determined...
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, if you go back to the last slide. Yeah, so I think that this second point of why do some people work against their own self-interest, really keep this question in the forethought of your mind, throughout this presentation, because I think that this is a really important point that we need to take away from this, and keeping in mind that everything that Robert just covered with the fact that revolutions do not spontaneously happen and then become successful automatically just through circumstances, and that it's through these myths working as a tool of us working against our own self-interest. So we just wanted to really emphasize this question. So just keep thinking about this, because we're going to talk more about this.
Yeah, thank you. And so that's something that was missing, according to Gramsci, was hegemony, or specifically cultural hegemony. So the traditional definition of hegemony is the political, economic, or military dominance of one group over another. So the word and the concept both have Greek origins. We can think of the various Greek city-states that dominated at one period or another, that formed alliances, which were usually solidified by military dominance. But what Gramsci developed was this idea of cultural hegemony. So he agreed with Marx's central tenet that the working class has to attain a class consciousness in order to overthrow capitalism. However, he disagreed with Marx that this is something that would happen as a passive event. He came to realize that capitalism is not just a series of economic relations, that capitalism actually perpetuates itself through ideology and actually changes the way that we think about the society we live in. So his idea of cultural hegemony can kind of be summed up as the ways in which a governing power wins consent to rule from those that it subjugates. So hegemony is no longer just about dominating through military force, although this is not to say that capitalism doesn't also rely on violence and repression, which it absolutely does. The key here is that in order to gain consent, that's where ideology and culture come in. So that's how you get people to work against their own self-interest. And so by consent, we mean the capacity of dominant classes to persuade subordinate classes to accept, adopt, and interiorize the values and norms that the dominant classes themselves have adopted and believe to be correct and proper. So the ruling class, so the capitalists, use ideology to masquerade their real objectives, which are to exploit workers, exploit the environment. You know, that's the only way that profits can be created, is through the extraction, and the economy continues to grow. But of course, no one is going to say these kinds of things out loud. The capitalists want to prove that they rule not for their own benefits, but for the common good. And so, I mean, this isn't to say that capitalists are evil necessarily and seek to exploit. You could almost say in some cases that capitalists are just as much victims of the myths and propaganda that prop up the system they are working, that system as the working class they exploit. And so what this does is just gives this commonsensical way of looking at the world that is in fact intended to make sure that certain intellectual and political ideas remain unthinkable. So there's really no range of thought for them to operate in, because anything that challenges capitalism is just not common sense. You know, it's just obviously not going to work. And so, you know, it just instills this idea that any alternative is going to be catastrophically worse, and that in any case, you know, even if we could imagine a better system, there's just nothing we can do about it. You know, we might as well just try and make the best of it. And so we can see that all around us today, most clearly from conservative and reactionary forces, but also from liberal and forces as well, who say things, like I said, it sounds good in theory, but what about in practice? And so this consensus culture develops in which people in the working class come to identify their own good with the good of the bourgeoisie and the capitalists, and help to maintain the status quo rather than push against it. And so instead of a genuine class consciousness forming, what the working class actually develops is what Karl Marx termed false consciousness. So this is the exact opposite of class consciousness, the exact opposite of where we want to go. It's individualistic rather than collective in nature. It produces a view of oneself as this single entity engaged in competition with others, of one's own social and economic standing, rather than as a part of a group with unified experiences, unified struggles, unified interests. I see a comment from Audrey. So culture of celebrity worship helps manufacture consent and creates a a friendly, inspiring liaison between the working class and the rich. Yes, that's, yeah, so exactly. So your boss is your friend. Sorry, Lily, were you going to say something? You're muted. Lily, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. I was saying I was just celebrating manufacturing consent, and like that great tie into that, because that's like Audrey completely spot on.
Yeah, so I mean, we could just look at the idea and the myth of the American dream, you know, as an example how cultural hegemony works to produce false consciousness. You know, we're told to believe that upward mobility is possible for everyone, regardless of their circumstances or their birth, as long as they choose to dedicate themselves, you know, get the right education, the right training, and just work hard. You know, and so again, that results in this perception of being an individual rather than part of a collective, and that our economic success rests upon our own shoulders, and you know, we fail to take into account everything else around us, the social, economic, political systems that shape our lives. Um, and social media really does play a big role in this, in forcing people to see themselves. You know, I think somebody mentioned at the beginning, you know, you got to market yourself, you brand yourself. You know, you're in constant competition, constant hustle against others who you actually share a lot more in common with than you think. And the bosses who might pretend to be your friends and pretend to have your interest at heart really don't. And so what Gramsci said was that the working class needs to create a culture of its own in order to counter these notions of the bourgeois capitalist class, that, you know, their values are the only values that represent what's natural and what's normal for society. And so this is one way that we can begin to push back. And so culture was kind of a hot topic in the early days of Marxism. Orthodox Marxists didn't really believe that culture played a central fundamental role. What we're looking at here is a fundamental concept. Lucas says, get out the chart. It's the classic chart of Marxism, or the classic diagram. So this is a fundamental concept developed by Marx that society consists of two parts. So you have the base, which are all of the forces, all of the relations of production. So, for example, the relationship between employer and employee, the divisions of labor, property relations, our economic class. You know, and these are the relations amongst people that are necessary to produce the things that we need to survive. Okay, and so the base determines society's other relationships and ideas, which compromise its superstructure. So this includes the culture, institutions, political power structures, myths, ideology, the state itself. And so this idea of Orthodox Marxists that the economic base is what determines the relations among people in society, and that culture was just a reflection of this. So for example, under feudalism, especially in the Middle Ages, the aristocracy derived its legitimacy from religion and the church. And so cultural artifacts like art, music reflected this. Gramsci really turned this on his head. In Gramsci's view, a class cannot dominate merely by advancing its own narrow economic interest and through force. Neither can it dominate purely through force or coercion. There has to be some kind of intellectual and moral legitimacy. And you have to create alliances with various forces, which he called historical blocks. So in Gramsci's time, the intellectual and the moral legitimacy came primarily from the church, which dominated civil society in Italy at the time. So a question that I want to pose to everyone, you can think about it in your head, or you can share your thoughts in the chat, or feel free to speak out. So thinking about the United States today, what institutions do we have that provide the intellectual and moral legitimacy for capitalism? And what are some ways that they do that? So I can give one example. The media. So Brian says the press, the legal system, think tanks. Oh yeah, it's a good one. Thanks,
I
Brad.
think this is a good one. Universities and higher education. Absolutely. Think about that giant Koch brothers endowment that just went to George Mason. Yeah, universities.
Yeah, so the media, universities, schools, social networks, the entire political system. Yeah, the two-party system, partisan politics. So the church to some extent. Yeah, definitely religion.
Yeah. And I think that the church is like a really interesting point to bring up, Adriana, because I feel like also like as far as this like discussion when we're talking about intellectuals, in a minute we're going to talk about organic intellectuals. I think that like now versus earlier times, we're seeing like a big shift in the church, and like you see like churches aligned really closely with like labor movements, like recently in Philadelphia for the nurses union. They had every major church across Philadelphia start to support unions. So it's interesting. Like I feel like we're seeing like a big shift in certain churches or faiths backing up like grassroots movements, and really like working behind like organic intellectuals. So that's definitely like a distinct shift that we're seeing.
Ninon says corporations memeing on Twitter. Yes, the Joel Osteen. Yeah, these are all excellent examples. And so as Lily hinted, so one of the things that Gramsci talked about were intellectuals, the people that really carry water for upholding the dominant economic system. So this idea that certain means of production will produce certain types of intellectuals who will then perpetuate the cultural hegemony necessary to reproduce that economic structure. And so the traditional intelligentsia that we see, especially in the United States, but really all around the world, portray themselves as neutral commentators. We can think of economists, not all, but some university professors and entire university departments, even entire universities themselves, writers, artists, journalists, in the same way that priests and clergy reinforce the social order during medieval feudalism, the bourgeois intellectuals today reproduce these myths and reinforce capitalist hegemony. Think about the way that bourgeois economists, even economists that like to portray themselves on the left or center left, will talk about things like rational self-interest, and academics that talk about concepts like human nature, that we're driven by greed and selfishness, and just throw these out there as if these are given truths. And have this pretense of their ideas being based on reason and enlightenment. But what Gramsci said is that he's not just talking about intellectuals like philosophers and poets, but also technocratic intellectuals. He called them the officers of urban industry. So think of the way that business schools produce technocratic managers of neoliberalism, your boss. And then going back to the media.
Yeah, so going back to the media, somebody has already brought it up tonight, manufactured consent. So thinking already about like what we have talked about like all the systems that we have in place, like our foundational myths about the country that we live in, about the forefathers, thinking about spontaneous revolution and how that like maybe isn't so much a thing. So thinking about like our intellectuals, and we just brought up the media. just like point blank, you can like raise your hands on your like button at the bottom of your Zoom, or you can type in the chat. Do you think that the media is biased at all? I think at this point in time, like most of us would pretty much agree. Yeah, that like the media is biased. Yes, Ren, the media is biased, like absolutely. I see. Yeah, I don't think that being unbiased is possible at this point. Joe says it's not just bias at this point, that it's owned. So we all can pretty much agree, right, that it's biased or that it's owned. So what are some real biases that we see in mainstream media, like across the board? You see, this is not even bias. They don't even report on the news. They've manufactured and produced the news and opinions. And then so I know that this sounds like a little bit like conspiracy theory, but like, what do y'all think about like the corporate agenda, right? So like if it's owned, like what does the corporate agenda like really play into this? Yeah, Ren, I agree. Like we see a lot of bias against direct action, right? Like I watch CNN all the time, and I feel like every news story starts with like uprising and protests are legitimate, but they're only legitimate if they're done peacefully, right? So establishing this norm that protests and uprisings can't be taken seriously unless they're held peacefully. Don't question moral authority or powerful men. Absolutely.
Yeah, and going back to protests, that's all based on this, again, myth of, the peaceful civil rights protesters, who abhorred violence and, just got the Civil Rights Act passed by marching peacefully over bridges. And no one ever mentions what happened when they got on the other side of that bridge.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and Lucas brought up like the coverage of Assange. We've got intelligence agencies like the CIA and FBI are trustworthy and mysterious, that they do important, noble work, right? Like we all saw that like recently with like the white nationalist like kidnapping plot and the immediate how wonderful the FBI is and law enforcement and how hard they were working to make sure that this didn't happen. Jeffrey Epstein killed himself. These are all great, and I think that y'all are going to really love our next portion. So let's go ahead and jump into manufactured consent. And we're going to play this video for you.
Beep, beep, beep.
Propaganda. Many use the word when talking about countries like North Korea, Kazakhstan, Iran. Countries viewed as authoritarian through the lens of the Western media. Press freedom, freedom of thought. People use those terms when talking about countries like the United States, France, Australia, democracies. In 1988, Noam Chomsky co-authored a book with Edward Herman called Manufacturing Consent. It blasted apart the notion that media acts as a check on political power, that media inform the public, serve the public, so that we can better engage in the political process. In fact, media manufacture our consent. They tell us what those in power need them to tell us so we can fall in line. Democracy is staged with the help of media that work as propaganda machines. Media operate through 5 filters. The first has to do with ownership. Mass media firms are big corporations. Often they're part of even bigger conglomerates. Their endgame, profit. And so it's in their interest to push for whatever guarantees that profit. Critical journalism takes second place to the needs and interests of the corporation. The second filter exposes the real role of advertising. Media costs a lot more than consumers will ever pay. So who fills the gap? Advertisers. And what are the advertisers paying for? Audiences. And so it isn't so much that the media are selling you a product, their output. They're also selling advertisers a product, you. How does the establishment manage the media? That's the third filter. Journalism cannot be a check on power because the very system encourages complicity. Governments, corporations, big institutions know how to play the media game. They know how to influence the news narrative. They feed media scoops, official accounts, interviews with the experts. They make themselves crucial to the process of journalism. So those in power and those who report on them are in bed with each other. If you want to challenge power, you'll be pushed to the margins. Your name won't be down. You won't be getting in. You've lost your access. You've lost the story. When the media, journalists, whistleblowers, sources, stray away from the consensus, they get flat. That's the fourth filter. When the story is inconvenient for the powers that be, you'll see the flak machine in action, discrediting sources, trashing stories, and diverting the conversation. To manufacture consent, you need an enemy, a target. That common enemy is the fifth filter. Communism, terrorists, immigrants, a common enemy. A boogeyman to fear helps corral public opinion. 5 filters, one big media theory. Consent is being manufactured all around you, all the time.
Whew. So, thinking about like everything that we've talked about tonight, thinking about like this video that we just watched on manufactured consent. I don't know about y'all, but I know that like when I first kind of grappled with the concept of manufactured consent, like I felt extremely overwhelmed. And the idea of like everything that we're talking about, like these foundational myths, the media, manufactured consent, like these are all things that are ingrained into our self, into our identities, our entire lives. You know, thinking that like the news is supposed to be reporting these unbiased truths to us, right? So that we can make up our minds, so that we can decide. So, you know, when we're thinking about like what was just talked about, this corporate agenda, like I know that it can leave you feeling like a little overwhelmed, to be honest. And, you know, just thinking about the fact that like this agenda isn't explicit, right? The corporate agenda isn't always really overt. It's not always going to be easy to pick out or identify. It's not that like newspaper editors or like newsroom producers are sitting around thinking about like, how are we going to push the corporate agenda today? How are we going to help prop up capitalism? But that it's a lot more subtle than that. It's more about how the stories are framed to us. So we see it in the selection of stories also. So it's not like there was necessarily a memo from the DNC or the Clinton Foundation ordering the Washington Post to say, put out one negative story about Bernie every hour for 16 hours, or maybe that did happen, but it's not always going to be this overt, right? Things like this, we can see this type of manufactured consent very easily. It's laid out for us plainly, but keeping in mind that it isn't always, that it is more subtle, that it is in the framing, and that it's specifically to do everything that we talked about earlier, to like reinforce these myths to us.
And so the antidote to this traditional, intellectual class is what Gramsci called the organic intellectuals, this proletarian counterpoint. And the awesome thing is that all of us are intellectuals. We are all thinking creatures. It's just we don't all get the opportunity. We don't all get the same platforms that traditional intellectuals do. But what is an organic intellectual? It's someone who doesn't seek to maintain the status quo. This could be someone who has gone through academia and quote unquote traditional outlets, but that's not a necessity like it is for traditional intellectuals. But it's also not, it's not something that's gonna keep you from being a quote unquote organic intellectual either. So these are people who are aware of their social class and position in it, compared to traditional intellectuals who try and pose as these neutral observers that are just explaining the world. An organic intellectual exists within their class and recognize themselves as participants in the struggle. And so they're able to articulate the needs of their class. One thing, I have a background in education, and so one of the thinkers that, I absolutely love, who's been, incredibly influential in my own teaching philosophy is Paulo Freire, and who really promoted this idea that students should not just be these passive receptacles, and the teacher is just passing along this information that students absorb, but that teachers and students are both growing in the process together. There's a more horizontal relationship between the teacher and the student, and that students create their own meaning, and that they not only describe the way the world works, but that they seek to change it. And so we have some of our favorite organic intellectuals here, Dr. Wolf, who we listen to on a weekly basis, his excellent podcast, Economic Update, Angela Davis, and then I forget this girl's name. I know her last name is Peltier, but she is a Canadian environmental activist who inspired Greta Thunberg. And so perhaps this is the reason why the ruling class fears critical theory so much, because people are being taught not just to be these passive participants, but to take agency and change the way society is. We see most recently, the Trump administration took the very extreme and unusual move of banning critical race theory from the entirety of government. We have ghoulish think tanks like the Heritage Foundation trying to influence our education system, which they no doubt will describe as being left-wing and Marxist, but which is actually anything but.
And now one of my favorite quotes ever, joined with one of my favorite memes. When education is not liberating, the dream of the oppressed is to become the oppressor. I think, which is like a great way to start out the idea of like political, cultural education and having it being available to everybody, like we talked about earlier, and I had reminded everybody to kind of like keep that question in the forefront of your mind of like, why would we as working class people continue to support efforts that foundationally work against us at every turn? Why would we continue to prop up these systems? Well, this has to do with like the availability and the access to this political and cultural education. If you can go to the next slide. So philosophy has only described the world, so now it's time to change it. That's like just kind of paraphrased Marx, but you know, keeping in mind like what we talked about, right? So like rapid, spontaneous mass movement is not what is going to be successful in creating accessible and activated class consciousness for everybody across the country, across the continent, across the world. Right, so it can't be leaderless. There needs to be leadership, it needs to be organized, and without having these structures in place, capitalists will just basically reassert themselves in our culture and maintain control. So what we really need is we need like this broad base of these organic intellectuals, people who are involved in like day-to-day class struggle, that really have like a clear view of what the aim is. What does it look like for everyone to have their class consciousness activated? What does it look like to not just activate people's class consciousness, but empower them to in turn influence everybody within their sphere, their friends, their family, their co-workers. So really creating a mass movement that is organized, that is educated, and with this goal of not just describing society and these systems that are in play, but changing the system completely. So having those leaders that have like this big picture view that can organize and educate everybody around them to really like peel back that veil of deceit. You know, so we're no longer thinking about like common sense or these cliches or these myths, really thinking outside of what has been provided for us and understanding like where we are set in this structure, and how culture and the political structure is influencing all of our actions, everything that we interact with and everybody that we interact with. So keeping in mind traditional intellectuals are doing and maintaining that work of hegemony, and the consciousness or unconscious, and thinking about organic intellectuals, they are going to be the pillars of any kind of counter hegemony. So next up is what's to be done. Oh, sorry. Sorry. So there's like the recap. So before we move on to the next couple parts, the things that you really need to keep in mind are that workers must be mentally and materially prepared for the revolution. And they have to be conscious to the extent of the exploitation. So they have to be conscious to the fact that like their boss is not their friend. There is no such thing as a benevolent company that wants to give you Labor Day off. That is not a gift to you. You do not thank your company for doing that. They are not doing that as a service for you or because they care about your well-being. They are doing that so that they can keep you in a state where you are not going to challenge the status quo, where you are not going to challenge how you are being exploited, to just kind of like keep you at this baseline. So thinking about class consciousness is the way in which people think about their social class, their economic ranking in society, and the structure.
And so looking back at, what we can take away from the theories developed by Antonio Gramsci and his writings, is just really this idea that, struggle is not a passive process, and it's a long-term, process. That struggle against capitalist exploitation is something that we consciously choose to do. And as people who are of the left or on the left or sympathetic to the left, we should take responsibility for what that actually means. And one of the specific prescriptions is the need to build a mass movement of people. We can't just rely on a small revolutionary vanguard class that, is going to violently overthrow the government. While that may have been possible in 1917 in Russia, that's just not going to happen today. And it's not going to happen in pretty much any other country. We need a mass movement of people who, can clearly understand their relationships between different classes, the relationships with their employer, with capital, the way that capitalism fundamentally needs exploitation in order to survive, and that it is fundamentally unsustainable. So, I mean, the long-term viability of our planet depends on it. The other main takeaway from Gramsci is that the cultural sphere is vitally important. So we should, we should compete on the cultural level. What does that look like? Does that look like memes? Does that look like writing articles in a newspaper? Those are certainly examples. There are some really great movements going on to develop and promote, left-wing alternatives to popular media, but that not to discount the cultural sphere, and that education as a political function is necessary in order to build these kinds of mass movements, to build this counter-hegemonic position. And so that doesn't necessarily have to be a lecture or a presentation like this. It means just talking to people around you. This fight, this long-term fight, isn't confined to the streets. This is something that happens at home, that happens at school, at work, in your family. And if we have some time, I don't know, maybe Lily will talk about, specific strategies for talking to your coworkers in the workplace. Even if you think your situation is futile and you are daunted by the fact of starting a union, there are plenty of other ways that you can stand up for your rights. And not only that, not only to win those material concessions, but also to engage your coworkers in a way that elevates their class consciousness, gets them thinking about their relationship to their boss and to their employer in a different way.
So like with everything that Robert was just saying, like grit and other myths of capitalism, like pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We wanted to just like talk a little bit about like what are some popular cliches that reinforce capitalism. So thanks, Robert. Yeah, so like what are some popular cliches that reinforce capitalism? Like these myths of being a self-made millionaire later to become billionaire, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And you can just type into the chat like maybe what are some other like workplace cliches that you hear like just throughout your entire life? Saving for retirement. There's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll. You can sleep when you're dead. Oh. Yeah, job creators, capitalists being job creators. We're all in the same situation, right? We're all in the same boat. We have to keep working to get ahead. Robert, you can go ahead and click to the next slide. Perfect attendance, yeah, at work and school, right? Yeah, like capitalism drives innovation. This idea of like hard work is always equaling success. Yeah, early bird, like the idea of like competitions and scarcity, like infringing on your private life. Yeah, like having employers that like the expectation is that like you keep up with like work emails, calls, text messages, handling emergency situations and your time off. So yeah, I think that all of these are really, really good examples of like these cliches, and right, like everything that we talked about earlier, like these cliches and these myths are dangerous, right? They're myths that hurt us. These are cliches that hurt us. Like I have family members, like I said earlier, like growing up in a working class family, having family members that like drive forth this idea of you have to kill yourself at work, right? You have to continuously like be hard on your body and work yourself to death because you are setting up a good scenario for the children that come under you. You know, like you want to make a better life for your kids than the one that you had. And then just continuing that cycle throughout life. So, right, so like all of these cliches, all of these things that we are taught, all of these like, I'm made of grit, I'm tough as nails, I'm hardworking, I worked for everything I had, all of these that we hear for our entire lives are really what build into these capitalist character traits. So thinking about like rugged self-reliance and like, when we go through these traits, like think about them in yourself. Think about them in yourself. Think about like people, family members that you know, people that you work with. You know, I know that like raising your class consciousness is long, hard work, right? This isn't a short journey. So a lot of these character traits are things that we take a lot of pride in. You know, like I know personally taking a lot of pride in like self-reliance. But really, when we talk about self-reliance in this frame, it's not self-reliance, right? It's the failure to recognize the extent to your reliance on other people. So we're taught to be proud of this self-reliance, which is really something to kind of detour us from forming solidarity, from counting on other people, from being able to ask for help, right? To engage naturally in mutual aid, because we're ashamed to. We're ashamed to let people know that we need this help. Also, this idea of personal responsibility, right? So with personal responsibility, like internalizing failures of yourself and others. So if you don't succeed, it's completely your fault. And it's through this personal responsibility, right, that like we personally accept and take the blame for things that our employers do to us, for things that like politicians do to us, you know, right? Like people reinforcing you'd be able to buy food, maybe you'd be able to afford your rent if you worked harder, maybe you need to work more than 40 hours. Multiple people have multiple jobs. Right? So this personal responsibility is constantly reinforced to us that it's our fault that society is treating us this way because we aren't earning our keep, really. So thinking about also like rugged independence, right, is this false belief that that individuals can affect change on their own. So failure to see the necessity in collective action or solidarity, just the idea that like I can do this on my own. And then I think that like the most insidious of these capitalist characteristics is really this idea of being a free thinker. Right? We all want to think that we are in control of how we are interacting with other individuals. We all want to think that these traits, this identity that we have formed, that our place in society has all been our choice, that we are actively making these choices our entire lives, right? Because we hear from a really small age, you can be whatever you want to be. You can grow up to be anything and everything that you want to be. You just have to work hard enough. So from a really early age in America, it's really like brought on that like we are in control of all of the choices, that where we are in life is simply just a result of all of those choices that we made. And that because of these foundational myths, because of everything that we are told our whole lives, we really truly think that we are free thinkers and that we are in control of all these elements, and we're just simply deciding what we do and what we do not participate in. So I personally feel like that's the most insidious, but like really altogether, these things, and they're really hard to break past. It's really hard to think that maybe you aren't as self-reliant as you really feel like you are, that you aren't making these choices for yourself. So moving forward to cultivating class consciousness. So when we're thinking about like talking to our family members, to our coworkers, to our friends. I think of myself when my class consciousness was like just first starting to develop and I was starting to understand, like the first thing I wanted to do was like hit everybody over the head with it and have these really heavy-handed conversations. So don't like this bonk. Do not and coworkers, right? We need to awaken class consciousness. Like we need all of our comrades, and we want to, right? Like you want to share this information. You want your family and your friends and people that you interact with to understand where their place is in society. To go back to another cliche, like ignorance is bliss. It is not bliss. It is actually extremely harmful to all of our existences, as a lot of people already know. And Jen, yes, you're welcome for Bonk Doge. I insisted that they make an appearance in this. But so for this next part, what we're gonna do, and we've really kind of gone through like all of the information that we had set out to present for tonight. But this extra element that we wanted to bring at the end is that cultivating class consciousness is difficult, right? Like Robert said earlier, it's a long process, it's a long journey, it's a continuing process. And it's one that also has like a social element to it, right? Like we are meant to engage with people. We are meant to like discuss these things and how they affect us. And so helping create or activate class consciousness in other people is really difficult. So we wanted to give people an opportunity to maybe like throw out some questions that they've been stumbling over, or maybe things that people have brought up in conversation that maybe you didn't quite know how to respond to them, or how to help kind of reframe and shift their view to help support this understanding of class consciousness. So the first example we were just going to throw out is one that I hear all the time from people. You're a socialist, you're a communist, how come you have a laptop? Why do you have an Apple iPhone in your hand? Why do I see you on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter? Like all of those are capitalist things. Like if you want to be a socialist, you better throw your phone in the garbage. So we are going to go to Robert to answer that question, because I think he answers that question beautifully.
I mean, so one of the things I like to stress to people when they bring up that talking point is the fact that, just because something comes out of a capitalist society doesn't mean that that was created necessarily by capitalism. We're taught to believe that, we're taught to see this relationship between, people and products. So, Apple makes iPhones, that's what they do. But what gets ignored in this conversation is that Apple doesn't make iPhones, its workers make the iPhones. That's the relationship. It's not between people and products, it's between people and their social relations. And so, there's absolutely no reason why a smartphone could not be created under a socialist system. I mean, would it be as fancy as an iPhone? I don't know. That's a hypothetical. But, we can have nice things under socialism. They would just occur in a system in which workers are not being exploited. We absolutely would not have smartphones that depend upon child slave labor on the other side of the world. But that doesn't mean that we cannot have nice things like this.
And also, right, like it goes like that whole idea goes back into like some of these myths, like the myths that we talked about before. Like this whole idea that like capitalism created technology, which just is absolutely not true. Like capitalism did not create technology. And did you want to go on to the next slide, and then we'll start? This is kind of like our backdrop.
Yeah, everything can be explained with a meme.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I like the point that Lucas brings up in the chat, that what often gets ignored and not talked about is, how much public investment goes into a lot of these things, like smartphones and all of the technology that we that we use.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that people are making some really good points. So yeah, so like I said, like we wanted to use this time to just kind of like go over some questions that people might be struggling with when they're talking to other people, or questions that you have yourself about this information. So Audrey, or was there one before? Sorry. Oh yeah, sorry, going back up to the top. So do you have a theory for the fact that we've never seen a true socialist system develop and thrive? Socialism doesn't mean poverty. Robert, do you want to handle this one? Especially because like, right, you were talking about kind of like the end of time earlier in the presentation and like around the revolution.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, Valentina. So yeah, I mean, I think, so, why, that's one thing that people, always bring up in counter argument. We've never seen, a true socialist system. People have critiques on, states that currently exist that call themselves socialist. With regards to that, I mean, I think the important thing to keep in mind is that, socialism is a process. The end goal is to have the society where, class distinctions no longer exist, where we no longer have to rely on a state, where there's no more exploitation. That is the ideal goal, which, has not ever existed in the world, but socialism is a process to get there. And countries do not exist in a vacuum. So, while actually existing socialist states, like say Cuba, for example, might be far from ideal, far from what we would ideally like to see, it's important to keep in mind, all of the external factors pressing against that, the challenges that they have to go against, in the form of embargoes and international pressure, and which have real material implications. And so, I mean, I don't have, a simple theory as to why we've never seen a socialist system develop. I mean, other than that, it's very hard to build, a truly mass movement, and especially in a country like the United States, in which the ruling class ideology is just so firmly entrenched. But I think, having a mass movement, like, shameless plug, DSA, to be ready to take advantage of a situation when it arises, to be ready to provide, leadership for people who are looking for it, people who might not identify as, socialist, communist, whatever, but, are ready for an alternative to capitalism. You know, one of the things that Gramsci stressed was organization. Our enemies are very highly organized. They know exactly what they want, and that's why they often get it. And so we on the left also need to be very organized and disciplined and, have solidarity with each other, to build this mass movement.
So then I was going to throw out, Brad posed the question of can the boomer class really be awakened? The myths are very strong. I think that the answer to that is like absolutely yes. I think that we see a lot of comrades who come from like older generations, and thinking that like one of like the strongest socialist and communist movements that the United States has ever seen gave birth to the baby boomers, right? Like they were all involved with that. But I think that, Brad, like you're bringing up like a good point, and that like generationally, like we need to think about like how these myths are in play, and really think about how like the silent generation, like what they passed on to their children were like these kind of like unobtainable values in a lot of ways of like morality and other things. So I mean, I think that when we are talking about like shifting class consciousness, we really need to be aware of like who we are speaking to, like who our audience is, like who is this person that I'm engaging in conversation, and personalizing it, right? Like that's kind of like organizer 101, like how to have a conversation with somebody, is you need to really intentionally think about who you are talking to. So not every talking point, maybe going through this presentation wouldn't be helpful for everybody. So I think about just like really genuinely thinking about the person that you were talking to and getting to understand like what are their issues, where are they in this social structure, how are they oriented to like what class struggle is. So getting to know them and like knowing what specifically their issues are, and then talking to them like through that entryway.
So we're cutting close to 8:30. I was going to continue the shameless plug by dropping links to our website and to our social media. If you'd like to be part of a burgeoning mass movement of socialists, come join us in the Charlottesville DSA. We're doing some really amazing, exciting things, and we would love to have more people involved. The next Socialist Night School is going to be on October 29th at 7 p.m. That's a repeat of Socialism 101, which is an introductory session looking at basic topics of socialism. So if you know anyone who might be interested, friends, family, who need their class consciousness raised, send them our way. So you can find, and I'm about to post our Facebook and Twitter as well.
Yeah, so Robert's gonna like post some links that you can like follow us on Facebook, you can follow us on Twitter, you can go to the DSA website to get more information. There's also a calendar of upcoming events on that page as well. And what we also wanted to extend to you is that like, even though we are wrapping up our presentation, we have some like music we're gonna play in the background as people kind of, you know, end their call. But we wanted to just like extend an invitation. If people have more questions, if people want to keep talking about things, if you have a question specifically about DSA, Robert and I are going to stick around on this call to either continue a conversation or to answer questions, or anything that anybody would like to talk about. We just want to make ourselves available to y'all.
Okay.
So thank you everybody for coming out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, comrades. This is hard, long work. So thank you everybody for joining us tonight.